My name is Isabella Whitmore. I am currently 31 years old and earn my living as an art provenance researcher based in Philadelphia, where my daily work involves meticulously investigating the historical ownership of artwork before it is acquired by major museums or private art collectors. This profession has instilled a foundational rule in me, one that I really should have utilized within my own household a long time ago. You must never put your faith in a beautiful narrative until you have fully scrutinized the hard evidence supporting it. I had dedicated nearly a full year of my life to financing an incredibly lavish 7-day holiday to Paris to honor my mother and father's 35th wedding anniversary. Every single detail, the premium business class airline tickets, a beautiful boutique suite situated right by the Grand Palais Calais Garnier, exclusive private museum excursions, high-end restaurant bookings, and a beautiful dinner cruise down the Seine had been carefully arranged and paid for through my personal financial accounts. The original arrangement was for me to go on the trip alongside them, document their milestone anniversary with my camera, and ultimately create a joyful family memory that I had spent years of my life trying to earn. On the exact morning of our scheduled departure flight, I packed up my car and made my way over to their residence with my luggage stowed away in the back trunk. To my complete surprise, my unemployed younger brother Caleb was standing out front right next to them, holding suitcases of his very own. My mother offered me a pleasant smile, acting exactly as though she were simply sharing a minor, completely inconsequential alteration to an ordinary dinner reservation. She looked at me and remarked that my brother was desperately in need of some relaxation. So they had made the executive decision to bring him along on the trip instead of me. To back her up, my father chimed in and remarked that I was completely self-sufficient, highly accomplished, and certainly mature enough to view the situation with understanding. My brother deliberately averted his gaze from mine, yet he showed no hesitation whatsoever in taking the premium passport holder that I had originally purchased for my own personal use. I chose not to stand there and engage in a loud confrontation. Instead, I calmly retrieved my own suitcase out from the trunk, presented my father with the comprehensive printed travel itinerary, and watched the three of them drive away inside the airport shuttle van that I had already covered the costs for in advance. What my parents completely failed to grasp at that moment was that the ultra-luxury components of this entire vacation only existed because I was officially registered as the primary customer on all the bookings. They departed under the false impression that they had successfully taken over my spot. In absolute truth, they had actually just boarded a flight directly into a massive financial trap constructed entirely out of their own personal greed and entitlement. Before I reveal the exact reality they uncovered the very moment their plane touched down, and clarify precisely why my younger brother tried calling my phone 12 separate times all the way from France, I want you to drop a comment letting me know what time it currently is in your corner of the world, and exactly where you are watching this from. I am genuinely curious to discover just how far this narrative manages to travel. I remained standing entirely still in my parents' concrete driveway until the shuttle vehicle finally rounded the corner and disappeared from view. Following that, I dragged my personal suitcase back over to my vehicle, climbed into the driver's seat, and just sat there quietly behind the steering wheel for a long time without even turning on the motor. I was not at all stunned by the fact that my mother and father had once again prioritized Caleb over my well-being. They had been consistently prioritizing his needs over mine since the days he was old enough to comprehend that his own personal failures could be easily swapped for rewards from them. I was deeply stunned, however, because they had boldly seized a vacation that was completely financed out of my own pocket, fundamentally reshaped it without bothering to consult me, and genuinely expected me to be grateful for the immense honor of being cast aside. My mother, Diane Whitmore, had dedicated the past several months to bragging to every single person she met that this upcoming Paris getaway was definitive proof of how remarkably close-knit our family unit had truly become. My father, Robert, had eagerly flaunted the luxurious travel itinerary to all of his close associates over at the local historical society. Meanwhile, Caleb had never contributed a lone dollar toward any of it. At 27 years of age, he had abruptly walked away from 3 separate jobs in a span of just 2 years, completely walked away from an internet startup after sinking money he borrowed from our parents, and moved himself back into their subterranean basement while loudly proclaiming to anyone who would listen that he was currently in the process of restructuring his career goals. Whenever I dared to speak up and inquire as to why they continually stepped in to bail him out of his self-inflicted messes, my mother would quickly defend him by saying he was incredibly thin-skinned and sensitive. My father would always add that young men occasionally just require a bit more time to discover their true path in life. Back when I was the one facing difficult times, the baseline expectation was always that I should figure out a way to resolve my dilemmas entirely on my own, without making a sound. Conversely, the moment Caleb experienced the slightest bit of hardship, the entire household dynamic immediately shifted and rearranged itself specifically to cater to his personal ease. I eventually drove myself back to my flat, set up my workspace, and pulled up the primary travel booking dashboard on my personal computer. The total cost of the vacation had run me north of $32,000. The airline tickets themselves were entirely paid for and fully adjustable because I had made the smart choice to purchase flexible business class tickets. The luxury suite at the hotel, the specific museum time slots, the private chauffeur transportation, the gourmet cruise, the exclusive art conservation workshop session, and multiple non-refundable restaurant down payments were completely registered under my personal legal name, my official identification, and the credit card currently sitting inside my wallet. I possessed the absolute full authority to wipe out the entire vacation plan with a single click. For a handful of tense minutes, my mouse arrow hovered directly above the cancellation option. A volatile part of my mind desperately wanted them to land at Charles de Gaulle Airport, only to face the harsh reality that every single luxury door had been firmly locked in their faces. Yet, a different part of my mind could hear that submissive internal voice I had been thoroughly conditioned to follow ever since I was a little child. It was the voice that constantly told me to never bring public shame upon the household, to never penalize my younger brother simply because he was struggling to find his way, to never provoke my mother's delicate anxiety, to always accept the burden of being the mature, level-headed individual. Listening to that passive voice over the years had drained me of an immense amount of capital, precious time, and personal self-respect. I dialed Naomi Carter, who has been my absolute closest companion since our days together in graduate school, and now works professionally as a specialized attorney, handling high-stakes cultural heritage and property lawsuits. She picked up the phone on merely the second ring. She immediately inquired if I wasn't currently supposed to be on an airplane making my way over to France. I replied by stating that, as it turned out, Caleb apparently had a much greater spiritual need for a Paris getaway than I did. After I laid out the entire sequence of what had transpired, Naomi went completely quiet on the other end of the line for such an extended period that I actually had to check my screen to verify if the cellular connection had dropped. After a moment, she asked me directly if they had ever officially requested that I transfer the legal names on the bookings over to them. I told her no, they hadn't. She then asked if they had bothered to ask permission for Caleb to use my premium flight ticket. I told her no. She followed up by asking if they had even given me a single heads up before I showed up at the house that morning. I repeated that they had not. Naomi then firmly asserted that I needed to stop framing this situation as a simple, innocent family miscommunication. She pointed out that they had outright stolen a premium gift and completely discarded the very individual who bankrolled it. Hearing the reality of my circumstances articulated so plainly, without any emotional sugarcoating, cleared away the internal fog. I logged right back into the administrative travel system. Rather than completely erasing the entire vacation, I systematically stripped Caleb of every single high-end perk he had absolutely no legal privilege to be utilizing. His first-class plane accommodations were instantly downgraded back to the standard economy ticket that my mother and father had covertly bought for him, using their own frequent flyer points. I completely terminated the private black car service because it explicitly mandated my physical identification to be present. I altered the primary lodging arrangement from a luxury 3-person anniversary configuration down to a standard double occupancy room for just my mother and father, thereby maintaining the core anniversary present I had genuinely intended to give them from the start, but entirely stripping away the connected secondary room, the inclusive morning meals, the private lounge access, the high-end spa bookings, and all the VIP club perks that Caleb was fully counting on utilizing for himself. I completely scratched his name off the private dinner cruise list, the exclusive museum entries, and the boutique art restoration tour. Following that, I took all of those non-refundable luxury bookings and transferred them directly over to a reputable local nonprofit organization in Paris that supports women's art education, a charity Naomi had closely partnered with in the past. As a result, a group of bright scholarship students would be the ones utilizing the exclusive museum entries and restoration workshops instead. My family members would still have their transatlantic flights and a roof over their heads. They were not going to find themselves stranded out on the streets of a foreign nation. However, they were no longer going to be living it up on a mountain of luxury paid for by me, all while maintaining the delusion that I was somehow being petty or unreasonable for raising an objection. That really should have marked the final conclusion of the matter, but it didn't. Naomi requested that I email her the entire paper trail of the itinerary, just in case my mother and father tried to turn around and legally accuse me of committing financial fraud or theft. While I was in the middle of compiling all the digital invoices, I spotted something highly out of place tucked away inside our shared digital travel directory. Someone had recently uploaded a high-quality snapshot of a relatively small, classic oil painting carefully bound in protective shipping wrap. The background of the image indicated it had been captured right inside my parents' own dining room a mere 3 days prior. I knew exactly what that artwork was the moment I looked at it. It was a modest, charming 19th-century landscape painting that had originally belonged to my late grandmother before passing down directly to my father. It wasn't an internationally renowned masterpiece, but its rich genealogical lineage held massive sentimental value to him. Or, at the very least, that was the belief I had held onto for my entire life. Right underneath that uploaded photo, I discovered a saved draft email written by Caleb, addressed to an art gallery broker based in Paris. In the text, he boldly claimed that this specific landscape piece had just recently been uncovered inside an uncatalogued private American collection, and he was inquiring whether the gallery could swiftly broker a highly confidential, under-the-table cash transaction during his upcoming stay in the city. Shockingly attached to that very email draft was an official provenance verification document completely outfitted with my own professional research credentials. My full legal name and title were typed neatly right below an official declaration statement that I had absolutely never written or authorized. Caleb had not merely hijacked my position on a luxury holiday. He was actively plotting to weaponize my hard-earned professional standing and industry reputation to liquidate family property utilizing entirely fabricated legal documentation. I immediately sent the entire set of discovered files over to Naomi. She firmly commanded me not to initiate any form of contact with him just yet, emphasizing the absolute necessity of locking down and preserving every single scrap of evidence, including the digital metadata, the network access history logs, and all corresponding emails. I did a deep dive into the historical activity logs of that shared digital folder. The records proved that my mother was the specific person who had uploaded the artwork photograph. My father was the one who had physically scanned an antique insurance record. Caleb was the individual who had physically put together the fraudulent provenance certification. They were absolutely not just blissfully unaware passengers caught up in his wild plot. They had actively rolled up their sleeves and assisted him in laying down the groundwork for it. Precisely at 14 minutes past 8 o'clock that evening, the very first text notification flashed across my screen from my mother. She wrote that they had touched down in Paris, but their private chauffeur was nowhere to be found, and she demanded to know if I could call up the transit agency to sort it out. I read through her text 2 times, calmly flipped my cellular phone face down on the table, and ignored it. A mere 6 minutes after that, a message came through from my father, stating that the front desk at the Paris hotel was claiming their premium suite arrangement had been drastically altered and insisting there had to be some sort of administrative error. Right on the heels of that, Caleb sent over an urgent, recorded audio clip. In a frantic voice, he barked that I needed to log in and immediately fix the hotel booking right this second, because the clerks were telling him that he didn't even have a bed to sleep in. I listened to his entire audio message completely through without typing out a single word in response. They were finally bumping up against a real-world dilemma that I had absolutely zero intention of resolving for them. But as I sat there intensely studying that forged legal document glowing on my computer screen, I knew with complete certainty that a missing hotel suite was going to be the absolute least shocking surprise waiting to hit them over in France. By the time the clock struck midnight back home in Philadelphia, my cellular screen was illuminating like a flashing control array in the middle of a catastrophic system failure. My mother had tried dialing me 4 distinct times. My father had attempted to call twice. Caleb had bombarded me with 9 separate text messages, with the phrasing growing increasingly venomous and entitled with each subsequent text. Initially, he tried to claim that the whole situation was just some unfortunate technical system glitch. When that didn't work, he pivoted to aggressively demanding that I put all the high-end upgrades back in place because our mother and father were completely drained from the long flight. Ultimately, he resorted to outright attacking me, claiming that I was deliberately going out of my way to publicly humiliate the entire family. I held back and refused to give them any sort of answer until Naomi had completely wrapped up her forensic analysis of all the digital activity logs. She initiated a call with me using a highly secure, encrypted video calling system and pulled up her desktop view so we could look at it together. The fabricated provenance statement had actually been reverse engineered from an authentic institutional report I had put together for a museum roughly 2 years prior. Caleb had meticulously mimicked the official layout, stripped away the institution's branding logos, completely swapped out the original description of the artwork, and digitally grafted a copy of my official legal signature that he had lifted directly off a scanned holiday greeting card I had sent them. The document boldly declared that I had personally performed a thorough physical inspection of the landscape painting, verified its exact historical chain of custody, and verified that there was absolutely no trace of evidence suggesting it had ever been stolen, unlawfully moved out of its country of origin, or subjected to any active ownership claims. Those specific analytical phrases carried heavy professional liability and immense legal ramifications. A commercial art gallery would legally depend on those statements. A private art investor would invest capital based entirely on them. If any major museum or employer caught wind of the fact that my professional identity was tied to fraudulent authentication records, I would likely find myself completely blacklisted from the industry for the rest of my working life. Naomi looked at me through the screen and stated plainly that this was an open and shut case of identity theft and attempted corporate fraud, and potentially even more severe, depending entirely on what exact legal representations Caleb had already put forward to the prospective buyer. She noted that my mother and father were undeniably fully aware of what was happening. They might try to fall back on the defense that they just blindly assumed I had given my blessing to the matter, yet they had never once asked me for it. Naomi pointed out that their lack of knowledge was completely intentional and calculated. She strongly urged me to fire off an official legal notification to the gallery broker in Paris without a single moment of delay. Together, we drafted a highly disciplined, precise email clearly declaring that I had absolutely never authenticated the artwork in question, had zero involvement in drafting the attached documentation, had never granted anyone permission to employ my name or credentials, and was officially contesting any potential transaction involving the property. I uploaded official verification of my professional identity and formal credentials, and explicitly requested that the brokers securely archive every single message and piece of communication they had exchanged with Caleb. Within less than 40 minutes of hitting send, a formal response landed in my inbox from a woman named Elodie Marshall. She wasn't just some independent, low-level art scout. She was actually the principal head of regulatory compliance for an incredibly prominent and highly respected international network of fine art galleries. Her written reply was extremely professional, measured, and direct. She informed me that her gallery had actually blocked out a private appraisal session for the very next afternoon because Caleb had insisted to them that he desperately needed to liquidate the asset immediately to secure capital for an urgent business investment. Furthermore, he had explicitly told them a fabricated story that my father was suffering from severe, rapid cognitive decline, and claimed the family was under immense pressure to finalize the cash transaction before complex adult guardianship proceedings stepped in to freeze their ability to sell it. In reality, my father was only 63 years old, highly physically active, and completely cognitively sharp. Caleb was intentionally painting him as mentally incompetent solely to manipulate the gallery staff into bypassing standard protocol and moving the transaction along as quickly as possible. Elodie immediately put an indefinite freeze on the scheduled session and asked me point blank if I wanted her team to contact the French police departments the absolute second Caleb showed his face at their offices with the artwork. Naomi chimed in and recommended that we hold off on filing an immediate international police report until we could ascertain with absolute certainty whether the painting had physically cleared customs security borders and exactly how it had been categorized on the official border logs. Right at that moment, my father attempted to call my line yet again. This time around, I actually pressed accept. "Isabella, what on earth did you do to our accommodations at the hotel?" he barked into the receiver. There was absolutely no gentle greeting, nor did he bother to ask if I was doing okay after being dumped on the morning of an international flight. I responded calmly, letting him know that I had fully taken care of and maintained the exact hotel room that I had bought for him and my mother, but had simply canceled the extra luxury amenities and rooms that were exclusively booked for my own use. He snapped back, yelling that Caleb now had absolutely nowhere to stay. I replied that if that was the case, he was more than welcome to pull out his own wallet and pay for a room of his own. My father countered, saying I knew full well that his brother had absolutely no money to his name. I pointed out that his financial state made it incredibly bizarre that they had chosen him of all people to accompany them on a premium high-end vacation. My father instantly dropped his volume, speaking in a low tone. He told me that they had simply made a tough executive judgment call based entirely on what was best for the overall wellness of the family unit. He then accused me of blowing the situation out of proportion and turning it into a petty act of revenge. I ignored his accusation and asked him a direct, ice-cold question: did Caleb bring my grandmother's landscape artwork all the way over to Paris with him? The sudden, heavy silence on the other end of the line changed the entire nature of our conversation. I could distinctly hear the muffled sound of footsteps and a door clicking shut in his background. "Why exactly are you bringing that up?" he finally stammered. I told him it was because someone had explicitly forged my professional legal signature on an art authentication document. He let out a sigh and murmured that it was never intended to cause me any real harm. That single admission was the absolute only confirmation I required. I stated that they obviously knew their son was in desperate need of a massive influx of cash to use as business capital. I pointed out that the painting had just been sitting away in dark storage collection bins for decades anyway. I noted that since I fully understood the ins and outs of these high-end transactions, they had blindly assumed that formatting their paperwork to match my professional templates would make the international gallery buyer feel completely secure. I clarified that they had deliberately assumed that manufacturing a completely fake authentication under my name would trick the buyers into feeling secure. My father's voice hardened as he warned me to stop taking that aggressive legal tone with him. I told him right back that he needed to stop dragging me into illegal, fraudulent behavior that explicitly requires legal terminology to address. My father let out a sharp breath through his nose. He claimed that they had fully intended to sit down and explain the entire situation to me the moment the transaction was fully wrapped up. I demanded to know if they had actually declared the high-value painting when they cleared international border customs. He snapped back that the artwork was his legal property. I firmly reminded him that his statement didn't answer the question I had just asked. Without another word, my father abruptly hung up the phone. Only a handful of seconds later, my mother's name appeared on my screen as she tried calling. Her speaking style was notably gentler, but the underlying emotional guilt-tripping was deeply, intimately familiar to me. She went on and on about how Caleb had been spiraling into a deep, dark clinical depression ever since he lost his last place of employment. She claimed that just the mere thought of visiting Paris had immensely elevated his fragile spirits. She then asked me why on earth I couldn't just find it in my heart to display a little bit of basic family compassion for once in my life, instead of approaching every single household dynamic as if it were a cold, calculated forensic investigation. I cut through her words and reminded her of the hard facts. I had entirely bankrolled Caleb's housing rent on 2 separate occasions over the past year alone, completely paid off his emergency auto repairs, and spent hours personally reconstructing his professional resume. She quickly dismissed those examples, claiming those were merely temporary personal loans. I pointed out that they were loans he had absolutely never made a single effort to pay back. She sighed and stated that I could easily afford to take the financial hit. And right there laid the core, foundational household doctrine that had dictated my entire adult life. The rule was that as long as I possessed the strength to survive being mistreated and financially drained, then draining me was considered completely fair game. My mother dissolved into tears the absolute moment I asked her straight out if she was the one who had physically taken the high-resolution photos of the artwork for Caleb's scheme. Through her sobbing, she finally confessed that she had indeed taken the photos, but she frantically doubled down on the claim that she genuinely believed I would eventually look past it and give the plan my blessing after the fact. "You have always been the one who steps in to fix everything," she whispered into the phone. "You are just so incredibly talented at making things right." I told her firmly that just because I have the capability to repair damage does not mean she has a blank check to go around creating absolute legal catastrophes under my professional name. Once the call finally concluded, I walked over to my closet and pulled down an old, weathered cardboard storage box that I had dragged along with me through 3 separate apartment relocations. Hidden away inside were old childhood birthday cards, academic report sheets, and envelopes stuffed with vintage photographs from the bygone era when our family still captured memories on actual physical film canisters. I was originally searching through the files to locate the very first art museum guidebook I had ever collected as a young girl. Instead, I stumbled across an artifact that was far more revealing about our family's true reality. Tucked away were 2 distinct candid photographs captured on my 16th birthday. In the very first image, I was standing proudly right next to a small birthday cake, holding up an official acceptance letter I had just received for a prestigious competitive summer art history program. In the second photograph, which the film metadata indicated was captured less than a single hour after the first, that exact same birthday cake had been physically shifted directly in front of Caleb because he had just come home after scoring a single winning goal in a local recreational youth soccer match. My entire milestone Sweet 16 celebration had been completely overwritten to become an impromptu party honoring him. Furthermore, the financial program deposit money that I desperately required to actually enroll in that art history course was ultimately redirected to pay for his elite soccer travel team registration fees. I vividly recollected how my mother had held my hand back then, promising me that my personal compromise would ultimately bring our family so much closer together. It did absolutely no such thing. It had simply served to educate them that absolutely anything of value belonging to me could be easily stripped away and handed over the very second Caleb threw a tantrum, or wanted it badly enough. This disastrous Paris vacation betrayal was not some random, out-of-nowhere anomaly. It was simply the most recent iteration of a long-standing household tradition. The very next afternoon, Elodie sent over an important progress update via email. She informed me that Caleb had actually physically shown up at the front desk of the gallery, despite the fact that his appraisal session had been completely terminated. He was carrying the historic landscape painting inside a heavy-duty padded transport container, and he became incredibly hostile and belligerent the moment the corporate staff flat-out refused to perform an evaluation on the piece. He loudly claimed to the staff that I was merely a deeply bitter pathological sister who was actively trying to sabotage his business success out of jealousy. He then aggressively threatened them, stating that he would simply take the artwork down the street and liquidate it through a much less regulated underground private art merchant. Fortunately, the gallery's internal professional security enforcement team fully recorded the entire hostile exchange and took high-resolution security photographs of the international shipping manifests pasted onto the exterior of his carrying container. One specific customs label clearly exposed that Caleb had explicitly written down the high-value historic artifact on his official border declaration forms as a simple, low-cost piece of personal decorative canvas material, assigning it a total financial value of a mere $200. Meanwhile, the exact asking price he was actively angling for in his digital email correspondence was €85,000. Naomi reviewed this data and noted that such a massive legal discrepancy could easily trigger devastating criminal penalties for him, particularly if he proceeded with attempting to close an unrecorded, highly commercial international transaction on foreign soil. I didn't experience a single drop of petty joy or satisfaction just yet. My mind was operating with an icy, absolute focus. My younger brother had fully operated under the expectation that I would joyfully bankroll his European travel, lend him my hard-earned professional name to commit fraud, shield him from any form of legal oversight, and ultimately sweep in to rescue him the exact second his criminal house of cards collapsed to the ground. My mother and father had maintained those exact same expectations of me. Later that same evening, Caleb finally decided to place a call to my phone, utilizing his own personal cell phone number rather than hiding behind our mother's device like he usually did. I accepted the incoming call and immediately initiated a high-quality audio recording of our conversation, having already double-checked the strict legal wiretapping and consent statutes with Naomi to ensure everything was fully above board. "You actually went out of your way to interfere and contact the gallery management," he barked the moment I picked up. I replied calmly that I had indeed done so, noting that he had absolutely zero legal authorization to do what he did. He scoffed over the line, saying it was just a few simple pieces of administrative paperwork. I fired right back, telling him that those specific pieces of paperwork were the absolute only reason anyone in the international art world was even willing to grant him a meeting in the first place. He then tried to turn the tables, claiming that I was just a deeply resentful person because our parents genuinely preferred spending their leisure time with someone who was actually fun to be around. He snapped that I always had to make absolutely everything so clinical and serious. He went on to assert that I cared far more about cold bureaucratic regulations than I did about supporting my own blood family. And right then, he uttered a highly damning statement that would completely obliterate his final shred of legal defense down the line. Both Mom and Dad were completely on board and agreed that you would easily step in to cover for us if any part of the plan went sideways, he boasted, before explicitly adding, "Because you always do." I stopped him right there and told him to repeat that exact sentence aloud once more. He did so without hesitation. I then looked into the mirror and stated firmly, "Not this time." Before he slammed the phone down, he leveled a final desperate warning, claiming that he was connected to plenty of black market associates who would gladly buy the historic painting off him without asking a single question about its background. I immediately dispatched that fresh audio file straight over to Naomi and Elodie. Within less than an hour of receiving it, the Gallery Network's executive team blast issued a high-priority internal security bulletin across all of their physical Paris branches and connected partner brokers, explicitly stating that the specific 19th-century artwork was currently the target of a major ownership battle and was traveling with completely forged legal credentials. Caleb's hopes of securing an under-the-table private transaction were completely disintegrating before his very eyes. But he still possessed one final psychological weapon to try and force my absolute compliance. He was actively using my mother and father's physical well-being and basic comfort as a hostage, fully confident that they would subject me to such immense emotional pressure that I would eventually cave and rescue him. The desperate actions he took next clearly demonstrated that he had completely failed to realize just how far I was truly willing to go to step completely out of the submissive role they had forced me into for decades. Early the following morning, my mother called me, whispering frantically from the confines of the hotel room bathroom because Caleb was currently stomping around and screaming at the top of his lungs out in the main area. The basic double occupancy room I had downgraded them to featured only a single queen-sized mattress and a temporary roll-away cot that carried a minor daily surcharge. But Caleb was flat out refusing to spend a single penny of his own money to cover the cot fee. To make matters infinitely worse, he had covertly swiped my father's primary credit card to bankroll high-end restaurant meals and expensive nocturnal club entertainment under the guise that he was out networking with high-net-worth investors. My father had ultimately been forced to completely freeze the account after a string of automated security notifications popped up on his phone, leading Caleb to turn around and aggressively accuse his own parents of actively destroying his professional future. My mother begged me through tears to please just put the original premium vacation package back in place until they could safely get back to the States. I told her calmly that I would only even consider providing any further form of financial intervention on the absolute condition that she and my father both sign a formal, legally binding written statement explicitly certifying that I had zero involvement in fabricating the provenance documentation and had absolutely never given my authorization for the liquidation of the artwork. She instantly bristled and took a deeply defensive stance. Your father will absolutely never put his legal signature on any document that could potentially bring harm to Caleb. She snapped back. I replied coolly that if that was their choice, then I would absolutely not be restoring a single amenity. My mother then loudly accused me of using my financial resources to completely manipulate and dominate them. I firmly reminded her that simply drawing a line and refusing to bankroll the consequences of their adult actions was not the same thing as control. True manipulation and control was them covertly hijacking my entire vacation, exploiting my professional portfolio, forging my legal signature, and fully expecting me to sit in quiet compliance. Over the next few hours, Naomi and I worked diligently to assemble an ironclad, comprehensive chronological timeline of the entire plot. The digital footprints revealed that this entire scheme had actually been set into motion a full 4 months before the Paris trip was even mentioned to me. Caleb had spent days digging through our shared family cloud storage networks to locate my professional research documentation. My mother had specifically captured and sent him high-definition, multi-angle source photos of the landscape piece. My father had intentionally gone into their homeowner's insurance records and completely removed the painting from the policy coverage list, falsely logging that the asset had been officially transferred over to a distant family member as a gift. Caleb had gone ahead and established a brand new international bank account based in Europe and fully locked in the gallery appraisal session long before my parents ever stood on that driveway and announced they were taking my spot. Casting me off the vacation was absolutely never a last-minute, spontaneous family adjustment. My literal physical presence on that trip would have instantly exposed the hidden painting and the completely fabricated authentication papers long before we had even checked our luggage at the airport counter. Even the specific location of the luxury hotel had been calculated purely because it sat within short walking distance of the gallery headquarters. The beautiful anniversary vacation I thought I was selflessly gifting them was nothing more than an elaborate smokescreen entirely bankrolled by my own money. I officially reported the entire fraudulent situation directly to my corporate employer before the delicate matter had any chance to spill out into the public eye. My direct managing supervisor, Dr. Helen Price, carefully looked over every single piece of electronic evidence I brought forward and immediately placed a high-security administrative alert on my personal digital signature template within the company network. She looked at me with deep reassurance and explicitly stated that my complete professional transparency was the exact thing protecting me in this mess. She added that my shared biological relationship with these people did not make me legally or morally accountable for their unlawful actions. Hearing that professional validation granted me something that my own mother and father had completely denied me my entire life. It offered me the full, unconditioned permission to completely detach my personal identity and self-worth from the toxic choices they made. Right around that time, my father sent over a highly aggressive, threatening email to my personal address. He boldly asserted that unless I immediately logged into the travel portals to restore all of their premium vacation perks and officially gave my blessing to the gallery transaction, he would systematically contact all of our extended family members and inform them that I had willfully and maliciously stranded my own aging parents in a foreign country. I wasted no time forwarding his blackmail attempt straight over to Naomi, and then typed out a cold, single-sentence response directly to him. I informed him that I would absolutely never sign off on a professional authentication report that I did not physically draft myself. I stated that I would not spend a single dollar to finance Caleb's ongoing lifestyle in France. I clarified that I would do absolutely nothing to obstruct or get in the way of a legitimate law enforcement investigation. Ultimately, I told him that any future messages or inquiries regarding the landscape painting would need to go directly through my retained legal counsel. A short while later, my maternal aunt Marjorie called my line after receiving my father's distorted version of the story. He had evidently spun an elaborate web of lies to her, claiming that I had flown into a fit of irrational, bitter jealousy the exact moment they made the gentle choice to bring Caleb along on the trip instead of me. Rather than engaging in an emotional debate, I simply forwarded the forged provenance document alongside the recorded audio clip of Caleb boasting about the scheme directly to her phone. She fell into a deep, stunned silence on the other end of the line before finally clearing her throat and making an unexpected confession of her own. She admitted that Caleb had actually pressured her into giving him a $12,000 personal loan under the false pretense of launching an upscale furniture import business, and noted that he had completely ghosted her without paying back a single cent. Driven by this revelation, other extended family members quickly began sharing similar stories of financial exploitation. By the time the clock struck midnight, we had piece by piece uncovered that he owed a staggering minimum of $46,000 spread out across 5 distinct family members. The covert liquidation of my grandmother's painting was absolutely never intended to be legitimate startup capital for a new career. It was a frantic, last-ditch effort to secure immediate cash to cover up a mountain of earlier lies before the entire extended family finally compared notes and exposed him. Before long, angry relatives completely flooded our private family group chat, uploading screenshots of written loan agreements and digital bank transfer receipts. My father tried desperately to step in and shut down the chaotic conversation, demanding everyone stop airing dirty laundry. My mother pleaded frantically with the group, begging everyone to just pause and wait until they returned home to talk. Meanwhile, Caleb turned to outright aggression, firing off texts accusing me of intentionally spreading malicious fabrications because I supposedly couldn't stand the thought of him being successful. However, the cold, hard receipts completely shattered the pristine family facade they had spent decades working to protect. Shortly before the sun began to rise, Caleb sent a direct photograph to my phone, showing himself standing right next to the Eiffel Tower, with the painting's protective shipping case resting on the concrete beside him. His accompanying text message was an outright threat, stating that if I did not immediately call the gallery to restore his appraisal appointment, he would deliberately abandon the historic artwork in a random public location where I would absolutely never be able to recover it. He was fully aware of how much my grandmother's memory mattered to me. He truly believed that weaponizing that emotional attachment would force me to step in and bail him out yet again. Instead of panicking, I instantly forwarded the image, along with its embedded digital location coordinates, straight to Naomi and Elodie. Then, I sent him a brief, chilling reply, letting him know that he should have never committed that explicit threat to writing. Acting on the high-priority security bulletin regarding the disputed artwork and suspected fraudulent commercial transit documents, French law enforcement officers approached Caleb near the Trocadero Plaza. They did not place him under formal arrest right then and there, but they legally confiscated the landscape painting to hold it for official verification and strictly ordered him not to leave the jurisdiction. The exact object he had attempted to use as psychological leverage over me was now completely out of his hands. For the absolute first time in his entire life, he had zero control over the situation, and neither did our parents. My mother and father finally touched down back in Philadelphia 4 days later, completely lacking both Caleb and the artwork. He was forced to remain behind in Paris because the local authorities were still holding the painting in legal custody. And because he had officially drained the absolute last drop of my father's accessible credit to retain a local French defense attorney. My parents walked through the airport gates entirely drained, visibly furious, and deeply publicly embarrassed. I intentionally did not show up to pick them up, refused to coordinate any form of airport transit, and did not stock their kitchen refrigerator with groceries as I routinely did whenever they traveled. They were forced to secure a basic rideshare vehicle to get back to their house, where a brand new financial nightmare was waiting for them. Before boarding their flight to France, my father had foolishly granted Caleb administrative access to his home equity line of credit so his son could flash a substantial balance to prospective international investors. During their time abroad, the banking institution's automated security systems flagged two suspicious. Massive electronic transfers, aiming to move a total of $70,000 out of the account. The bank instantly froze the entire credit line, mandating that both of my parents physically present themselves at the branch for an intensive fraud investigation review. Given that my father had spent his entire professional career working as a highly strict municipal budget director, this unfolding scandal directly jeopardized the pristine civic reputation he valued far more than basic personal honesty. My mother dialed my number right from the bank lobby, her voice shaking as she told me that they desperately needed Naomi's legal services. I reminded her coldly that Naomi was my personal corporate attorney and represented my interests exclusively. She cried out over the line, exclaiming that they were my parents and deserved loyalty. I fired right back, noting that they were also my parents when they actively forged my professional credentials to commit fraud. She wept further, whimpering that they had already endured more than enough suffering. I asked her to name a single consequence that they had actually stepped forward to accept voluntarily. She had absolutely no response to give me. Every single drop of hardship they were currently staring down existed solely because an outside entity had finally stopped shielding them from the direct impact of their own terrible decisions. 2 days after that encounter, my father aggressively demanded an emergency family summit. I showed up at the house, but I made sure to bring Naomi, Aunt Marjorie, and 2 of our adult cousins along with me to serve as objective witnesses. Caleb was patched into the room via a live video stream originating from a grim, budget hotel room on the outskirts of Paris. Naomi calmly stepped forward and distributed physical folders to everyone in attendance. Inside were comprehensive paper records containing my original travel invoices, the unauthorized modifications they made, the forged provenance report, the email logs from Elodie, the customs violations data, Caleb's written extortion text, and a full ledger of his outstanding debts to our relatives. My father stubbornly left his folder resting firmly shut on the table. I looked him dead in the eye and demanded he tell the room exactly why they chose to strip me off the trip. He parroted the exact same old line, muttering that Caleb was simply in desperate need of a peaceful rest. In response, I physically pointed to the digital timestamps, showing that the gallery meeting had been locked in long before they ever made the swap. I told the room the real truth. They cast me out because they knew I would recognize my grandmother's painting the instant I saw it and put a screeching halt to the illegal sale. My mother instantly buried her face in her hands, while my father sat completely mute. From the video screen, Caleb loudly argued that the painting was legally our father's property and claimed I had absolutely zero right to meddle in their financial affairs. I reminded him sharply that he had physically used my signature to pull it off. He shrugged it off, claiming he had merely borrowed a formatting template. I stated that he had explicitly lied to an international business, claiming I had personally verified an artwork I hadn't laid eyes on in years. He snapped back, saying he only did it because the gallery network implicitly trusts my professional name. The entire dining room went completely ice cold. He had just openly confessed to the exact motivation behind the forgery, right in front of a room full of hostile family witnesses. Aunt Marjorie immediately interjected, loudly demanding to know when he planned to return her unpaid $12,000. The other cousins quickly chimed in, echoing her demands for their own stolen funds. Caleb tried to dismiss them, shouting that his personal debts were an entirely separate matter. Marjorie fired right back, telling him that every single lie was deeply connected by his total lack of integrity. My father tried to step in to defend him, claiming that the successful art sale would have completely wiped away Caleb's financial troubles and finally allowed our family unit to heal and move forward. I looked at my father and told him that they were never helping Caleb move forward. They were simply helping him bulldoze and conceal the path of destruction he left behind him. Then, I finally gave voice to the heavy burden I had carried deep in my chest for decades. I told my parents that they only ever labeled me as strong whenever they needed permission to mistreat me without feeling guilty, and they only ever labeled Caleb as fragile whenever they needed an excuse to reward his bad behavior. Those psychological labels were never honest descriptions of our characters, they were simply tools used to exploit me. My mother quietly confessed that she genuinely believed I could handle the pain of being left behind because I possessed a thriving career, while Caleb had absolutely nothing to his name. I asked her why on earth his complete personal instability somehow entitled him to harvest the fruits of my hard work. She lowered her head and admitted that they were simply terrified of what destructive actions he might take if they ever dared to tell him no. I told her that by refusing to face that fear themselves, they had systematically transferred the cost of his terror directly onto my shoulders. I looked at them both and stated that every single time they shielded him from basic disappointment, an innocent person was forced to pay the price. Right then and there, I officially announced the hard boundaries that I had already set into stone. I informed them that I had completely frozen the secondary credit lines I bankrolled for them, officially removed them from my corporate cellular plan, and permanently terminated the automated monthly bank transfers that I had set up to cover their suburban property taxes, country club memberships, and Caleb's automotive insurance. Over a span of just 5 years, I had quietly funneled more than $58,000 of my own income directly into maintaining their household. Those days were completely over. My father slammed his hand down, loudly calling my actions an act of cruel financial warfare. I looked him in the eye and said no, I was simply returning the financial accountability to the actual grown adults who generated the expenses in the first place. I also made it explicitly clear that my corporate employer had fully archived the forgery and that I was fully prepared to cooperate with any incoming criminal investigation. Caleb panicked through the screen, asking if I truly intended to throw my own brother in prison. Naomi stepped forward and clarified for him that the choice to pursue criminal prosecution rests entirely in the hands of the state authorities, not with me. For the first time in his life, he could not manipulate me into being the person responsible for either saving his skin or destroying his life. My father made a desperate final attempt to guilt-trip me, claiming that my late grandmother would absolutely despise seeing her family completely torn apart over a simple painting. I looked at him one last time and said we were absolutely not divided over an artwork. We were divided because he had weaponized the concept of family love to ensure I was never allowed to protect myself or say the word no. Without another word, I stood up and walked out of the house. 3 weeks after that meeting, reality hit my father hard. He was forced to personally hire expensive defense counsel, gather stacks of financial records, pay massive administrative penal fees, and book a flight all the way back to Paris at his own personal expense to legally retrieve the confiscated painting. The International Gallery Network officially blacklisted Caleb from their entire global system and blasted his forged documentation out to all of their industry compliance partners. Our relatives actively initiated formal debt collection lawsuits against him. The bank completely terminated my parents' home equity line of credit permanently. My father was forced to resign in complete shame from the Historical Society's Financial Oversight Committee the second the executive members discovered the truth behind the fraudulent sale. My mother abruptly pulled out of multiple local social organizations because she could no longer manipulate the narrative to save face. Not a single one of those devastating consequences stem from malicious gossip or a desire for public vengeance on my part. They materialized solely because the objective evidence made the truth completely impossible to deny. For nearly 2 full months following the incident, my mother and father tried desperately to reach me through every single communication channel they could find. My mother bombarded me with long text paragraphs detailing her severe stress-induced insomnia. My father left endless voicemails barking about the sacred nature of family loyalty. Meanwhile, Caleb wildly alternated between pathetic digital apologies and sending vitriolic messages blaming me for ruining his life. I intentionally chose not to block their numbers right away, purely because Naomi explicitly advised me to archive every single message in case they attempted to level additional fraudulent claims against me down the road. Reading through their incoming messages with an objective mind exposed a psychological pattern that I had been far too close to see before. My mother's apologies centered entirely around her own personal emotional distress. My father's regrets focused strictly on my negative reaction to their choices. Caleb's remorse was reserved exclusively for the real-world consequences hitting his lifestyle. Not a single one of them possessed the integrity to write out a clear, unvarnished confession of what they had actually done to me. "We are so incredibly sorry that the anniversary trip turned into such a massive, unfortunate disaster," my mother wrote to me, using phrasing that made it sound as though a random thunderstorm had come along and spoiled a pleasant picnic. "I deeply regret that the legal paperwork ended up being so severely misunderstood," my father typed, as if an intentional, forged signature were nothing more than a simple typographical error on a page. "I'm sorry that you felt replaced," Caleb messaged me, smoothly attempting to transform a cold, calculated physical betrayal into a subjective emotional oversensitivity on my part. I finally broke my silence and sent a single, definitive text back to their group chat. I told them that a real, meaningful apology requires an individual to explicitly name the exact choice they made, fully acknowledge the precise harm they caused, and willingly accept the real-world consequences without demanding immediate emotional forgiveness. I told them to only contact my line again when they were capable of doing all three. Following that text, I stopped responding entirely. Cut off from my steady stream of financial support, my parents were abruptly forced to make drastic lifestyle adjustments that they had spent decades actively avoiding. They were forced to put their oversized, expensive suburban house on the market and relocate into a significantly smaller, modest townhouse. My father had to prematurely liquidate funds from a private recreational investment account just to stay afloat and cover the mountain of international legal expenses required to recover the painting from France. My mother was forced to forfeit her luxury leased sports vehicle and took on a part-time consulting position at the local community college, where she had previously only volunteered her time. They immediately began whining to our extended family that I was the cruel entity who had forced them to downsize their entire lives. Fortunately, Aunt Marjorie was right there to correct the narrative every single time they tried to spin it. She told them flatly that their daughter had simply stopped paying bills that belonged to them and reminded them that stopping an act of charity is not the same thing as stealing from someone. Caleb finally shuffled back to the States after my father bought him a basic economy flight ticket on the strict, non-negotiable condition that he formally enroll in a structured, state-monitored debt management program. Predictably, within less than 2 weeks, he walked away from the program because the financial counselor insisted he legally disclose every single creditor he owed money to. This time, however, my father stood firm and flat out refused to allow him to move into the new townhouse, partly because the smaller layout lacked a basement space, and partly because the bank's fraud investigation had deeply terrified him. Caleb was forced to couch surf with various friends until those acquaintances quickly discovered that he was secretly hitting each of them up for substantial personal loans. Left with zero options, he eventually took a low-level warehouse job located out on the fringes of Baltimore and moved into a cramped apartment shared with 2 fellow laborers. He spent his days whining incessantly about his circumstances, but for the absolute first time in his existence, his physical survival did not depend on resources being systematically drained from my life. Meanwhile, my own life began to expand in beautiful, quiet ways. Dr. Price officially selected me to head up a brand new, high-profile institutional research project centered entirely around diagnosing forged provenance records and advancing digital signature security protocols. The exact traumatic betrayal that could have easily obliterated my professional career was transformed into the very foundation for groundbreaking work that protected researchers all across the globe. Naomi and I teamed up to build a specialized educational seminar for smaller independent galleries, private estates, and art collectors to teach them how to identify manipulated documentation. We utilized completely anonymized data and never once uttered my family's name. Yet, every single time I stood before a crowd and taught the module regarding how fraudsters utilize emotional pressure, I understood deeply that fraud almost never actually begins on a piece of paper. It initializes the exact second a person convinces themselves that another human being's personal boundaries are completely less important than their own immediate desires. Exactly 6 months after the Paris disaster, I packed my bags and flew back out to France to speak at a major international research conference. This time around, I was traveling entirely on my own dime and strictly for myself. I checked into a charming, modest hotel nestled right along the canal. I spent my days engaged in deep, intellectually stimulating conversations with world-class art conservators, historical archivists, and global compliance experts. Elodie personally attended my keynote presentation and later introduced my portfolio to a major Museum Foundation executive board that was actively hunting for a long-term expert consultant. On my very final evening in the city, I took a walk down to the exact art restoration studio that I had originally booked for that ill-fated family vacation. The managing director instantly recognized me and remembered that I was the individual who had donated the premium appointment slots to the local scholarship fund. He eagerly introduced me to one of those very students, a brilliant young woman from Lyon named Camille, who had actually secured a highly coveted, fully paid professional apprenticeship as a direct result of that donation. She proudly walked me over to a historic wooden panel she was actively stabilizing and thanked me from the bottom of her heart for granting her that life-changing introduction. I stood there and reflected on what my family had fully expected that week to look like. They had envisioned a mountain of luxury being carelessly consumed by a group of people who had actively thrown me away. Instead, by drawing a line, a fragment of that wealth was repurposed to create a profound professional doorway for a deserving young woman who truly treasured it. That was the absolute first moment I felt a true sensation of deep internal peace. It wasn't an act of sudden emotional forgiveness, nor was it a desire for a happy family reconciliation. It was just pure, unfiltered peace. It was the complete, beautiful absence of any lingering internal debate within my own mind about whether I had been too brutal or unyielding with my boundaries. The day I returned home to the States, a handwritten letter from my mother was waiting for me inside my physical mailbox. Completely unlike her endless stream of digital messages, this letter did not open with a long monologue about her own personal suffering. She wrote down in clear prose that she had indeed photographed the artwork, actively helped Caleb map out the travel logistics, and willfully allowed him to harvest my professional portfolio because she had trained herself to believe that I would simply step in to protect them like I always did. She explicitly confessed that she had toxically confused my personal reliability with ongoing blanket consent. She openly acknowledged that she had consistently treated my independent nature as a convenient excuse to give me less love and support, while systematically treating Caleb's complete lack of responsibility as a reason he deserved more. She did not beg me for immediate forgiveness. Instead, she informed me that she had formally entered weekly psychological therapy and stated that she completely understood and accepted it if I chose to never grant her my trust ever again. My father dispatched a completely separate written letter about 2 weeks after that. His words were notably briefer and clearly far more agonizing for him to pen. He openly admitted to the fact that he knew the provenance documentation was an absolute fake from the start. He explained that he had foolishly convinced himself that the ends justified the illegal means because successfully liquidating the artwork was the only path to prevent our relatives from discovering the full extent of Caleb's predatory debts. He wrote a line that I will never forget. I believed I was actively protecting our family's sacred reputation, but the truth is, what I was protecting was nothing more than an elaborate lie. He informed me that he had completely stepped down from his position at the Historical Society permanently and had actively begun making monthly financial restitution payments to Aunt Marjorie to cover the legal expenses she racked up while chasing Caleb. His written words didn't magically erase the deep wounds of the past, but they finally mapped out reality without aiming a single drop of blame in my direction. Caleb, predictably, sent absolutely no such letter. Instead, he took to his public social media accounts to post vague quotes about how toxic, cold-hearted family members will occasionally go out of their way to deliberately sabotage a person who is just trying their hardest to rebuild their life from scratch. He was smart enough not to type out my explicit name, but our extended relatives recognized the underlying narrative immediately. Absolutely no one stepped forward to defend his stance in the comments. Lacking an enabler's audience willing to validate his distorted reality, he quietly wiped the post from the internet a few hours later. As the holidays approached, my parents tentatively reached out to inquire if I would be willing to attend our traditional family Thanksgiving dinner. I calmly declined the invitation. I explicitly told them that I possessed absolutely zero desire to sit around a dining table and perform an elaborate act of fake family harmony just to capture a nice holiday photograph for show. Instead, I agreed to meet my mother completely alone at a neutral neighborhood cafe for exactly 40 minutes. We sat over coffee and strictly mapped out the explicit, non-negotiable practical boundaries required for any form of future contact between us. I laid down the law. There would be absolutely zero requests for financial aid, no encoded messages or updates carried on Caleb's behalf, no revisionist history regarding what transpired in Paris, and absolutely zero expectation that full access to my life would magically return simply because a certain amount of time had ticked off the clock. She quietly looked at me and agreed to every single term. When we both finally stood up to exit the cafe, she softly asked if she could wrap her arms around me for a hug. I deeply appreciated the fact that she actually paused to ask for my consent. I looked at her and said, "Not yet." She gave me a slow nod and walked out the glass doors without breaking into tears, initiating an argument, or attempting to guilt-trip me. That singular, quiet act of her fully accepting the word no was infinitely more profound and meaningful than every single dramatic, tear-filled apology she had ever thrown my way before. A full year after the Paris incident, the historic landscape painting was officially returned and hung quietly on the wall of my parents' new townhouse. My father actually reached out and offered to legally sign over full ownership of the artwork to me, but I calmly turned down the offer. I did not require a physical canvas hanging in my apartment to prove that my late grandmother's beautiful memory belonged to me just as much as anyone else. Instead, I commanded him to retain a certified estate attorney to draft an airtight, lawful will and testament that could absolutely never be covertly altered or exploited the next time Caleb ran into a self-inflicted financial disaster. He followed my instructions completely. My relationship with my mother and father never returned to the codependent dynamic we maintained before the trip, and I do not view that as a tragedy in the slightest. What we were practicing before was absolutely not genuine family closeness. It was simply unchecked access to my life without a single drop of personal accountability. In its place, we piece by piece constructed something far smaller, more restrained, and infinitely more honest. I see my mother on rare occasions. My father and I trade brief, structured phone updates. They remain permanently locked out of my personal bank accounts, my professional portfolios, my upcoming travel itineraries, and my digital passwords. True trust was not magically restored by a shared genetic line or standard expressions of regret. It is being carefully rebuilt only where consistent, changed long-term behavior actively supports it. Caleb was left entirely responsible for navigating the mountain of his own debts. Several of our relatives established strict, legally binding monthly repayment timelines with him, while a few others moved forward with securing formal court judgments to garnish his wages. He managed to maintain that warehouse position far longer than any of us ever predicted, and eventually leveraged that experience to transition into mid-level logistics coordination work. Whether he is actually undergoing a deep, internal moral transformation is a question that I completely choose not to carry. My true psychological freedom initialized the exact second I stopped treating his personal transformation as my ultimate assignment in life. Occasionally, people look at my story and inquire if completely cutting off those Paris vacation privileges was just an act of cold-blooded revenge. I fully comprehend why they might view it through that lens. My mother and father walked onto that airplane, expecting to be greeted by a private chauffeur, to lounge inside a luxury hotel suite, to enjoy elite VIP museum tours, and to rely on my effortless financial rescue the moment things went sideways. Instead, they were forced to share a cramped, standard double room alongside the exact toxic son they chose over me, and were dragged into confronting a mountain of hidden family debt they had spent decades actively concealing. But the truth is, I did not orchestrate or manufacture their financial downfall. I merely stepped back and withdrew my personal money, my physical labor, my professional name, and my ongoing silence. Their entire family structure collapsed into dust simply because those were the exact four pillars that had been holding the weight of it up all along. That realization became the absolute central, guiding lesson of my entire adult existence. Firm boundaries do not ever destroy a healthy, loving relationship. They merely expose the fundamentally toxic ones for what they truly are. A person who genuinely cares for you may feel a wave of temporary disappointment when you establish a boundary, but a person who depends entirely on exploiting your kindness will always scream that your boundary is a malicious act of betrayal. For my entire life, my family showered me with praise, calling me the capable, deeply dependable daughter. I spent years foolishly believing those words were a sign of deep respect. In truth, they often only meant that I was the designated mule expected to silently carry whatever heavy burdens Caleb flat out refused to hold. The absolute second I stood up and rejected that toxic role, they immediately flipped the script and labeled me as cold and heartless. My fundamental character had not altered a single bit. The only thing that had changed was their access to my resources. I also discovered that the concept of personal forgiveness and the act of relationship reconciliation are two completely separate dynamics. Forgiveness is an internal process that frees your mind from living inside the continuous loop of the injury. Reconciliation, conversely, is an explicit choice that grants an individual renewed access to the intimate spaces of your life. The first dynamic can be achieved entirely in private, inside your own heart. The second dynamic strictly demands real, objective evidence over time. Empty verbal apologies are absolutely not enough. True, consistent behavior modification is evidence. Displaying genuine patience is evidence. Showing absolute respect for the word no is evidence. My mother and father eventually began demonstrating a few small fragments of that real-world evidence, so I made the choice to allow limited, controlled contact. Caleb completely refused to display any such change, so I choose to remain completely distant from his life. On the exact 1-year anniversary of that fateful trip, Camille sent over a beautiful digital photograph taken right inside the high-end conservation studio where she had just officially signed her very first long-term professional employment contract. Right underneath the image, she typed a brief note. A single canceled spot on a vacation completely changed the entire direction of my future. I pulled up that image and saved it directly next to that old scanned physical photograph from my 16th birthday, the painful image where my cake had been physically moved away from me and placed in front of Caleb. That old childhood snapshot perfectly crystallized absolutely everything my family unit had systematically stolen from me over the years. Conversely, Camille's triumphant studio photograph beautifully represented everything that becomes possible in this world, the exact second you stop allowing toxic people to dictate who deserves to stand in your place. I once spent a long time believing that true victory would mean standing back and watching my mother and father drown in deep regret for replacing me. As it turned out, their ultimate regret mattered infinitely less than I ever could have anticipated. The absolute real triumph was looking in the mirror and realizing that not a single soul on this earth could ever replace me inside a life that I had fully, boldly claimed as my very own. My ultimate value as a human being was never something determined by the premium airplane seat they handed over to my brother, the boutique hotel reservation they stripped from my name, or the perfect family vacation photograph they tried to stage without my presence. It was vividly demonstrated by the professional career I built with my own hands, the integrity I protected at all costs, and the boundaries I finally and absolutely refused to surrender. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.